Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining today's climate webinar. We're going to get started with the pre-recorded content and will be available after the content to answer questions live. So with that, let's dive in. Just a little bit about Malk Partners and Malk as part of SLR and introductions. My name is Brian Schmellick. I lead the private equity team here at Malk Partners. Those are relationships with all of our middle market investor clients and their portfolio companies. The focus of today's webinar is on the middle market and on small and medium-sized businesses. Joined here by my colleague, Brian Fox, who will introduce himself in a moment. But Malk is the preeminent ESG advisor to private market investors. Private markets is all we do. And that includes advisory, strategy, and increasingly climate, the focus of today's webinar. And we are now part of SLR Consulting, a global environmental consulting firm with offices and resources in more than 30 countries. And we are working with SLR to continue to deepen our suite of climate services and help businesses of all sizes meet their climate targets. Brian, if you'd want to introduce yourself briefly.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Brian. And as you guys can imagine, we go by Brian Square at a time, so manage the two names here. But I oversee our Carbon and Climate Solutions group at Malk Partners. This includes partnering pretty closely with Brian Schmellick and a lot of our other mid-market clients and their associated portfolio companies. And today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about kind of that 0 to 1 or the 1 to 2 on carbon accounting, climate planning. Basically getting started with this for the first time with your portfolio companies and kind of what that looks like when rubber meets the road for building these climate strategies with your investments. I'll go quickly through our webinar agenda for today, kicking off with really just an introduction to what climate planning and carbon accounting looks like in the private market ecosystem. We're going to dive into a little bit of what we consider common pain points and strategies for managing those. We'll also go through what to kind of really expect out of a carbon accounting exercise and where that turns into value for investors themselves, as well as for the companies that are conducting these exercises. Where we kind of see the climate ecosystem moving as it relates to private market investors. And then a bit of an overview on how we support our clients kind of day to day. So when we think about Malk's carbon and climate business, where we really like to see the value that we add to our clients' management of these topics is kind of operating as their expertise and their boots on the ground for really kind of creating action on this. We see ourselves in a position where we have a lot of exposure working with clients all up and down the capital stack, but also with their portfolio companies that are operating in lots of different industries, different sizes, and especially in different maturities of their climate journey. Where we try to add a lot of value is getting ahead of our clients' expectations on this. Sometimes when they're taking the first step, or if there's something that they're working towards, we can kind of see what's happening in the ecosystem as it relates to upcoming regulation, how industry frameworks are viewing this and these topics, and kind of what the expectation is, and ensuring that their programs as they're building them around carbon accounting or their climate strategy are kind of aligned with those more macro topics and things that we're kind of associating ourselves with. We also really kind of pride ourselves on the fact that we're mixing expertise from that consulting angle and the advisory with tech-enabled tools. So we have some industry-leading capabilities and software tools that help us do these processes. And kind of putting those together, we feel kind of achieves that expert perspective and approach, but also has the tools to ensure that this is done kind of with a lot of value.
Our perspective on the climate space, especially for the middle market and for small and medium-sized businesses, is that this is changing really rapidly. 3 years ago, very few of our clients and their portfolio companies track carbon data in any sort of structural way. Today, around half of our clients do this work with us. And what we found is that trend is only accelerating. This is due to many of the drivers that we're going to cover later in this webinar. But our perspective on this is that this is a new skill for many businesses. And so it requires a real expert-led approach to get to a strong outcome because the complexity associated with this, but also the opportunities make it really necessary to be intentional about how you go from 0 to 1, from 1 to 2 on carbon and climate to ultimately make sure that this is a sustainable initiative for your companies.
So just to kind of put a bit of a value behind our carbon footprint or kind of that base of a climate strategy, there are a couple of key items that are applicable both to investors themselves as well as at the portfolio company level. And I've kind of highlighted a few of these that I think are really worth speaking through as they can kind of really put the why behind the process and what we're hoping to achieve. First of which is that the idea of carbon accounting and having an approach to climate is really becoming an industry norm. This is something that we're increasingly seeing as an expectation from LPs as it relates to the data they're collecting from the managers, and is central to a lot of the reporting frameworks that are also a big part of annual reporting. Having a carbon footprint also provides meaningful operational insights. This helps companies and their investors really see what's happening at the ground level. And if we think about benchmarking, or if we think about intensity around carbon, sometimes this will highlight things that we might not have missed, or that we may have missed, sorry. Thinking about if there are ways to make a process more efficient, or if we can relocate in a way that'll add more value to a company's operations. Even more so at that company level, the same way that investors are facing pressure to think about managing a carbon footprint, that's exactly the case for companies themselves with requirements coming from their customers. We've seen an explosive growth around the requirements from blue chip customers around disclosing the carbon intensity or the service level emissions of a business. And this also trickles into many of the companies that we're used to working with and kind of that you're investing in yourselves. And lastly, this isn't going away. We expect that managing a decarbonization strategy and kind of building a overarching climate plan is going to be central to future activities. And starting with a baseline carbon footprint is really the center of that.
This is really a new category of data, and Brian will get into how to parse through this data in this slide. But what we find is that this is the start of a journey, and one of the things that we're going to talk about later is that this can take multiple years, but consistent progress is really the name of the game here. And so how to communicate that to portfolio companies such that they understand that expectations are going to change over time, but ultimately you're getting to an outcome that is really valuable for the business.
Absolutely. And as that is currently evolving, especially when you see things like regulatory requirements or changing expectations from customers, some things that don't change are the approach that's being taken for building this baseline around emissions and kind of the carbon accounting process. So I do want to kind of spend a little bit of time talking about some of those high level definitions that we'll refer back to. We're not going to get too technical with what all the different scopes mean, but I think it is important to have that to refer back to. And the reason I'm saying this doesn't change is because the approach that companies use today for carbon accounting hasn't changed much since the early 2000s. All carbon accounting should be done under the guise of the GHG protocol, specifically its corporate standard. And we work with companies to really build this into their process to ensure that the numbers and the figures that we're reflecting are perfectly in line with that. So just to kind of go over this at a high level, what we frequently kind of refer to are scoped emissions, and that's scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Scope 1 are direct emissions. Those are really the emissions that come directly from the combustion of fuel or other resources at a facility site or as a part of managing vehicles or fleets. Scope 2 is anything that comes from the purchase of electricity or outside energy. So think about turning the lights on or any part of your process that requires electricity. That's scope 2. And then finally, scope 3 is really everything else. So that's thinking about the value chain emissions. That's thinking about business travel, waste from operations. It's really everything that contributes to your business represented in a kind of a third party perspective around carbon. A couple things just to talk about here as well. Scope 3 is central to understanding the big picture, but we tend to really try to get businesses to focus on that Scope 1 and 2 through a baseline emissions assessment. And the reason for that is Scope 1 and 2 are typically what lie fundamentally under an organization's operational control. And that's kind of a fancy way of saying that these are the things that an organization can influence really directly in a shorter period of time. And that they might feel more empowered to actually kind of get involved with this, think about ways to build into their corporate strategy or their corporate development plan, and then start building policies around them.
Great. So speaking to the room here, a mixture of general partners and their portfolio companies, an interesting data point that we've gathered by surveying our clients and their underlying assets over the last few years is that there really is a big gap in prioritization of climate and carbon between GPs and their portcos. As you can see in the center of the slide here, right? 92% are looking to prioritize this at the GP level, whereas only 35% of it are looking to prioritize at the company level. We think that this belies a few kind of underlying issues that need to be addressed. The first is knowledge gap. Why is this important? GPs tend to see this as more important than their portfolio companies because they have more immediate reporting concerns, a broader view across their portfolio where maybe this is more material for some and not others, and a real perspective on improving the data quality operationally in a business. The second is around what can be done with a carbon footprint. So it could be that GPs understand a little bit more about decarbonization, science-based targets, net zero, some of these topics that can feel a little bit remote to portfolio companies that don't even have an accurate understanding of their initial footprint. And what this translates to is that about half of companies are either not even thinking about this or not feeling prepared related to carbon footprint expectations. And so really, if we believe this data, it's on the GPs to help portfolio companies feel more in control of carbon, better understand why it's valuable, and ultimately take the actions needed to improve the quality of their data and get to actions that can create value for themselves as portfolio companies. So as we get into the meat of these practical tips, a lot of that stakeholder management is going to be central to this discussion. Both how do you build buy-in, and then how do you streamline the process so that once a carbon footprint starts, it can feel like a success, even in year one. So with those pain points in mind, there are four big ones that we frequently see when we do carbon accounting for companies. The first is pretty basic data collection, right? To get to a carbon footprint, there's a number of underlying data sources that companies need to be able to provide. It's around utilities information, activity, spend information, just basic business operations and business information. I'm sure many of the attendees on the call today can empathize that some of this data doesn't live in an easy to gather format. It doesn't live in a spreadsheet somewhere. It is a series of documents living with different people at different facilities. And so capturing that data in a consistent and high quality way is one of the biggest pain points that we see. And oftentimes in year one, the first thing that we spend time on is data organization. And that can reveal broader trends in data management at an organization, such that carbon is something that you want to organize around, but also your company may realize that they don't have a great handle on other aspects of business data flowing in from facilities. So can certainly spark a conversation about how to better organize that. The second is the stakeholder coordination. This is related to data quality, where if the data is fragmented and doesn't live with one person, you have to manage all the people who currently own that data to get them to report it in a consistent way and a consistent format. So getting a champion for carbon accounting is a great starting point, but that champion at the portfolio company may not have the data from individual facilities. They may not be able to interpret that data or understand when it is right, wrong, or in the middle. And they may not be able to use that data to actually drive change once the carbon footprint is completed. The third is the pursuit of perfection. As I said earlier, we see the carbon and climate journey as multiple years, especially for small and medium-sized businesses. And it can feel like a failure in year one if you don't have perfect data, if you don't have all the information from all your facilities, you don't have spend data or activity data, you have to use estimates. And so we sometimes see that as a barrier to even getting started on carbon accounting and decarbonization. Organizations will say, we don't think we can do this well, so we're not going to do it at all. But we actually see it the opposite, that getting started is the most important thing. Even if the first year of data is really bad, it shows that there's areas to improve the next year and the year after until one day, hopefully soon, you get to the point where carbon accounting is easy. It's automated, something that you can do in a few hours every year, and you can drive real insights from that data because the data is so high quality. The last item here is the lack of guidance. And this is partially due to the proliferation of carbon accounting softwares, right? It sounds like such an easy solution. We have a software, we onboard it, we put data in the tool, and a carbon footprint comes out the other side. But what we found is that fundamentally, this is a garbage in, garbage out problem. And when the data quality is poor, it can be very difficult to understand what needs to happen to improve that data quality if you're only using a tool, right? The tool will accept the data, it'll spit out a number. How accurate is that number? What needs to change about that number? Or what do you do to create value with that number? Those are all things that aren't provided by an automated solution. And so we frequently see challenges with inaccurate initial assumptions that change wildly year over year, a lack of context, or a lack of organizational design and directive, not being able to build those stakeholder and data sources that results ultimately in a lack of implementation of a tool.
So kind of building on those pain points, if we think about what makes a carbon accounting process successful, aligning the vision and connecting what your goals are as a GP to kind of what success looks like on the ground with companies. We can kind of highlight a few areas that tend to meaningfully contribute to a positive process. First of which is really thinking about presenting that background. We've seen at times when this is kind of just thrown on companies and said, we expect a carbon footprint. That's when we're not able to kind of really connect the process to the why. But if we can say to companies, this is really important to our investor base, this is really important to our long-term strategy, as an investor, we really like your help making this happen. Sometimes that connects the interest of the companies themselves in this as well. Also thinking about that value, reviewing why this matters to the companies themselves as well. If this is something that they can take strategic information out of and also align themselves with the expectations of their customers, that sometimes also kind of creates interest at that level. I'll really highlight this middle point because this is where we've seen a ton of success, is always starting with training. Every single time we manage this process on behalf of one of our clients, doing this across the portfolio, the first thing we do is really host a portfolio roundtable where we have points of contact from every single company, and we'll be walking them through what this process is, what's expected of them from a time commitment, what kind of data they're going to be looking for, and where they should expect to find this. And many times it kind of creates a sense of continuity across all the different groups here. You have the consultants, you have yourself as the GP and the companies, but also the companies themselves realize that they're working together on this. They're not just in a vacuum, but it's really an initiative that works across the entire group of organizations. Another thing is really prioritizing the simple data inputs for folks at organizations who may have really never heard of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Sometimes those can be scary data points to start looking for or working with. And that's why we try to focus on what are those inputs that are going to be required to get to the final output. And that's just thinking about what a facilities list look like, understanding the spend or bills on utilities, on fuel, what does a fleet look like? Just those things that we know our points of contact are going to be familiar with and hopefully are going to know where to go to find those pieces of data. And then lastly, and this is something that Brian Schmelik has kind of talked a lot about, is this really being a journey. We want to partner on progress. We want to understand that we want to get to that first emissions footprint for a company, and building on that year over year to kind of improve the quality, understand how we can automate this over time, build those systems to keep track of this data, and then work towards ways that this will continue to improve year over year.
I think a big theme from the outcomes that you see here is that ultimately this is a business function. Right? Many of the folks on this call, as well as the people that you interact with in this process, may have a certain perception of climate and carbon. It's very politicized, right? It's in the news a lot. But fundamentally, when you have a really strong process, it feels like another business function. It should feel normal. It should feel like a place where you can make slow progress and generate value. And so to work from left to right on this slide, the first is really key business information. And that is something that we oftentimes overlook because the carbon accounting number is an output of the key business information. And that's obviously the focus, the end of a carbon accounting process. But when you get really good information about how much you spend on power, the potential fugitive emissions from things like refrigerants, where there may be leaks in your facility that are costing you money, or some of the inefficiencies in your process that result in higher cost, that can be a really actionable insight that all of a sudden has an impact on the bottom line. And that insight is where you get more visibility and you can spend more time trying to process optimize this, and you end up with a double materiality, which is really exciting. So you can reduce your carbon footprint and you can save money. That's meaningful to some of your constituents, to customers at times, to investors, but also it does impact the bottom line, which is great. The clear output is a really valuable piece here. A theme of this webinar is really demystifying a lot of the first, second, third time doing this carbon accounting. And when the output is clearly understandable and you can understand why you got there, if the number increased or decreased year over year, you can trace that back to the business changing. That really means that you have a really high quality carbon accounting footprint, a really high quality program related to this. And the final is this auditable data trail, right? Like any other type of data that is reported annually and reported to investors, reported to customers, it's really important to have that auditability to say, if a number did change, why did it change? If we were wrong, where did we go wrong, so that we can prove year over year? And if you can kind of string these things together, produce a really high quality carbon footprint, you ultimately are producing a better data management practice for your portfolio company. As I said earlier, typically when a company is doing their first or second year of carbon accounting, it brings up a broader discussion of how do we manage operational data as an organization? Is this a work stream that we can feed into a broader ERP implementation or a broader approach to better data management and reporting? And across this set of data, but also everything else, how can you use that to drive better decision-making and more efficiency?
I think kind of just to double down on that and add some antidotes as well. In many cases, when organizations have to go through this for the first time, it exposes a bit of high level vulnerability, in the sense that why is it so difficult for us to just understand how much money we spent on electricity last year? That's something that businesses often think they'll have with ease, but in practice it can often be much more difficult than expected. And kind of with that in mind, this also leads to a lot of organizations saying, okay, one, because this was so difficult, we need to have some processes in place, but also two, there's fundamentally something wrong with the way that we're managing data. I can say that at least once a year, I have an organization that I'm working with, and they'll say, hey, Brian, it's kind of funny you're asking for all of our utility bills. We just had the electricity turned off at one of our sites. This just really highlights that we need to have a better way of managing this. So kind of connecting that key business information to the idea of those inputs we're going to need for creating a defensible carbon footprint. that's just a clear way we can connect the business inputs and the business priorities to why these outputs around carbon are important. So once we've gone through this process, we've worked with an organization to really identify what all those key inputs are. The Malk team works through putting that through our software tools and coming out with, basically a carbon footprint inventory, or what an organization's carbon footprint is going to look like for a year of operations. So this is kind of just a representative inventory that a company might expect to see. You can see that this is obviously a more asset-light business based on kind of some of those scope 1 and 2 emissions. But just looking at this from a third person's perspective, it's kind of hard to justify what is a metric ton of CO2e. What does that mean to my business? And this is where it's really important to think about kind of translating that into an intensity. So what is the CO2e per $1 million of revenue? Or what are the emissions associated with producing a set number of units or customer service, whatever that metric may be? When we're able to get this down to an intensity figure through revenue or employees or production, that's where we can really meaningfully think about what does benchmarking look like. Okay, if we take one business that's able to create 100 widgets with 100 metric tons of CO2e versus another company that's creating those same 100 widgets for 200 metric tons of CO2e, that highlights that there's really some efficiencies to be gained and ways that a business can kind of use this as a way to think about how do we operate more effectively. Also thinking about moving from this footprint to value creation, when we see some of these areas where there's a hotspot, or we can see that an element of the business might stick out more than another, that's where we can say this is something we'd like to prioritize and where we want to think about highlighting for the next piece of a carbon accounting journey. So if we're doing this next year and the following, we might want to get more accurate or more into details about certain elements of a piece of this, and then investments we can make to either have an effect on that or trial different things that are going to long term maybe change the way a business is moving in a certain direction. So when we think about the climate maturity curve, obviously that first approach at carbon accounting is something where everyone needs to start. But what we do see more regular than folks might think is there sometimes tends to be a natural inclination to want to run before we walk, or walk before we crawl, however we want to kind of use that analogy. But what that really means is we might do a baseline target setting, and then a company or an investor says, well, let's start thinking about a decarbonization strategy. That's not always the best thing to do right away once we do that, conduct an exercise. Where we really like to try to get our clients to focus on a year 2 or a year 3 exercise is digging into data accuracy. Okay, what are those core inputs that we used the first time we did this? Where did we have to fill some gaps? Where did we need to estimate? And then going back the following year and say, what can we do as far as a data capture perspective, or working with our points of contact to fill those gaps and standardize some of this so we have meaningful data that we can point to year over year to have that accurate footprint. Because once we have that data accuracy, that's where we can start thinking much more meaningfully about what are things on the decarbonization side we can look towards. Will that be operational efficiencies? If there are some things we want to look to about how we're purchasing electricity, or maybe even do we want to talk about engaging the value chain on scope 3?
One of the biggest mistakes that we see GPs make with their portfolio companies is a pressure to get to a target for improvement, or even as aggressive as a net zero target. It can sometimes stand to reason that, hey, if we set a target around something, what gets measured gets managed, we can start to push our companies to reduction, and they're going to be more motivated and more creative in finding those reductions. But as Brian mentioned, that data quality really changes over the first few years. And so it's very common for a carbon footprint to go up dramatically in the second year as data quality improves, you get a better accurate understanding of your information. So what we found is that target setting too early or getting to let's offset the emissions that we have is counterproductive because it's not a true representation of the organization. It can feel like carbon becoming a cost center before it gets you to savings, right? If you're paying for offsets. And ultimately, it can be a distraction from the work of let's build a better base of operational data that we can use to make better decisions.
Yeah, and Brian, I really like that point you mentioned about this being a cost center, where we really like to think about where the idea of climate lives is as a value creation tool. This should be something where we can use as a means to think about improving the business rather than we just need to get to a lower number, we need to get to zero, and therefore we need to put resources and assets into it. That's kind of working backwards on, I think, what a lot of the long-term approach to economic decarbonization is seeking to kind of achieve. The one thing I will caveat, and I'm sure that this is something that many of the businesses that we work with are kind of going through, maybe some of the companies that are part of this group as well, is in many cases there may be very real pressures to either set a target or start looking at decarbonization, maybe because of a customer request, or there needs to be alignment with a framework like the Science-Based Targets Initiative. When that's the case, what we try to emphasize is the focus on both where we can. Okay, we might have to set a target. We might have to start reducing emissions in the near term, but we should also constantly focus on how do we improve the data inputs while also finding these opportunities to kind of reduce emissions at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. And while this is the maturity curve, businesses stop, start, and stay on different parts of this curve over time. Meaning there are some businesses that are going to be very asset light, where there are not immediate drivers for decarbonization, for net zero, for offsetting for whatever reason. And the opportunities to increase efficiencies of a business are limited. And that's fine, right? Carbon data is a steady state work stream of data that is important for regulatory and customer reporting, as we'll get into on the next slide. But not every company needs to end up in a net zero future, right? That's not the ambition. And what we find is that when working with asset light businesses, if that is the start of the discussion, you're immediately fighting an uphill battle. So how do you kind of, again, couch this as an operational work stream? And it's something that is aligned with the business's ultimate goals and not just external pressures. So let's talk about the regulation, right? This is going to be one of the factors that really impacts decision-making around carbon accounting, around decarbonization, around net zero. And so to speak to the left side of this slide here, the first is the California Climate-Related Financial Risk Act and Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act. So the two large bills coming out of California that were recently signed into law. And what this does is requires businesses of a certain size, $500 million for the first and $1 billion for the second, and with exposure to business in California to disclose information about physical and transition risks associated with climate change. So the operational impacts that climate could have, and then also disclose scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions. To reference the slide that Brian walked through earlier, that is direct, purchased, and value chain emissions. And so what that means for small and medium-sized businesses is that if you are in the supply chain of a large organization that is subject to these regulations, you may be asked for data to help with their disclosure. And so that's one of the drivers that we see for small and medium-sized businesses, even those without a clear decarbonization plan to track emissions data so that they can report it to customers and stay competitive in that vendor process. To highlight a few of the outside the US regulations, the biggest of which is the EU Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive. So that's CSRD. So that's for large organizations based in Europe, really requiring a view of material ESG issues, climate included, that takes both a financial and a risk-based materiality, a double materiality. And it's an extensive reporting regime that is kicking off. And again, we're seeing real pressure for large organizations to comply and take steps to prepare the disclosure, but also suppliers to those organizations receiving requests from their customers to make sure that there's compliance there. And so ultimately, there's been a lot of interest from governments, state level governments in the US, but larger governments in Europe, Australia, et cetera, to see more information about emissions and see more information about the physical and transition risks of climate, such that they can understand where their economy is positioned in terms of the kind of global push towards decarbonization.
Yep. And then kind of on that topic of decarbonization, this is something that we see as really a growing trend that has no indication of kind of slowing down. I think the first big reason for that is decarbonization can really be seen as good business and communicates that an organization is running more effectively. One of the best examples of this in the marketplace is if you look at an organization like Coca-Cola. They said years ago that if we have a fixed amount of carbon that's required to create 100 cans of soda, if we're able to create those 100 cans of soda for less emissions, less intensity, less energy, we're effectively running our business in a better state. So kind of with that in mind, being able to reduce emissions associated with your business in many lights translates to running your business more effectively. Similarly, there's a large push from either reporting frameworks or businesses on this as well. One of the things really worth highlighting is the I mentioned earlier, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or commonly referred to as the SBTI. And the reason this is coming up more and more in kind of our ecosystem is you have those large corporate players. So I said Coca-Cola, but if we think about companies like AstraZeneca, like Microsoft, like Siemens, these are businesses that are, very often buying either services or solutions, products from the companies that kind of operate in the middle market. And as we see these large organizations set decarbonization targets, a large piece of that is ensuring that their own value chains follow a carbon reduction journey. With that in mind, if you're selling products or services to an AstraZeneca, they're going to require that you have a target in place and that you follow this journey alongside with them so they can reach their own goals. So that's something we're really seeing kind of come to fruition here. Lastly, and I think we can all agree that this is something that might be changing in the future months, but in the US level, there are incentives being talked about around decarbonization and electrification, incentives around that. We are tracking how that's going to change with the new administration. We will constantly be advising our clients on how we can make best use of some of these incentives around implementing decarbonization strategies.
Okay. So just to end here with how we support our clients. As Brian mentioned on one of the earlier slides, we take a really full service approach to this that includes both software and services, because we know that in the middle market, there's no one size fits all approach to this. And having somebody to guide you through these initial steps of the climate journey really results in better long-term outcomes. A more prepared portfolio, more prepared businesses, more comfort, more efficiency. And so some of the things that we do is we have dedicated climate experts who can help individual portfolio companies answer questions, find alternate sources of data if the perfect data doesn't exist, help them map out why this matters to their organization and start to think about where they can deal with decarbonization. We have our data platform that can help house and warehouse this data, show insights and visualize that information as well. And then now that we're part of SLR Consulting, we have a global network of sustainability professionals who can help actually decarbonize assets and decarbonize supply chains, take the steps necessary to take action based on the footprint that is produced as part of a reporting exercise.
Great. So I think with that, we'd really love to open it up to questions and see how we can provide some insight that wasn't covered as part of this webinar.
Right. Well, thank you everybody for spending the time with us through that recording. And we're now going to open the floor to questions. We already have a few in the chat, so we'll start there. But as things filter in, please use the Q&A feature and we can monitor that, make sure that we're providing some answers. So perhaps I'll start here. Somebody asked, are the surveyed GPs and portcos mostly US or EU based? Both. Thank you. So that's referencing a previous slide where we talked about some of the attitudes of both GPs and their portfolio companies related to carbon accounting preparedness. And to give you a sense, it's majority US GPs and portfolio companies, probably 60-40 US, Europe. There's more information available if anybody's interested in those survey results. We can certainly provide that after the webinar if you send us a note.
Great. And I'll tackle the second question here. So this is from one of our attendees. Do you see portfolio companies using free tools for carbon accounting and energy management, i.e. EPA Energy Portfolio Manager? And if so, where do you see challenges arise? This is something that we see some of our clients come to us when they tried to use this a previous year and didn't work out super well, either with a portfolio or directly with a company. And I think that kind of does speak to where issues do arise. And that's really because when these exercises do happen for the first time, it really exposes where those data gaps are. And when we're leveraging free tools or an unguided approach, that's where a lot of times organizations have a very hard time kind of filling those gaps. And the project kind of at hand tends to break down. So if we're in the process of gathering our inputs around energy usage or fuel, and we realize this doesn't really exist in some places, some of our facilities or some of our operations, sometimes it just stops there. Versus when we're working with companies, we kind of just use all the data available. We'll say this is going to capture about 70% of our operations. We have really great estimates we can plug in where data is missing. And then kind of with that approach led by us, we're able to have a very representative understanding of what that business's carbon footprint is that they may not have been able to do on their own with some of those free tools.
Yeah, I think the operative term here is garbage in, garbage out. And so controlling for the data inputs requires some expertise that some companies don't have when they're using a free tool. To reference that earlier, contact us if you're looking for more on that survey data. You can see it on the slide here, our contact information. And so hopefully that will be helpful.
Great. So I think if there are no further questions, then we can break for today. This is a recorded presentation, so this will be available if anyone wants to reference back to this or circulate amongst their network. And then of course, please feel free to reach out to us directly. We're more than happy to have any conversations about what this looks like for you, your portfolio companies, or kind of just the effect it has on kind of just ESG at large. So. We have our contact information here, and we look forward to having the opportunity to collaborate with many of you going forward.
Thank you all.
Take care.